This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. A new artificial intelligence tool is causing concern and excitement in the classroom, depending on who you ask. The tool that we're talking about today is ChatGPT. You may have heard about it, and if you haven't, well, you definitely will now, because we have two people thinking and writing about AI's role in the academic world and how ChatGPT comes in. Alfred Guy is the R.W.B. Lewis Director of Writing and Tutoring at Yale University, and we have Jeff Young, who is the editor at EdSurge, an education journalism initiative. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Do you have a question about ChatGPT? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Jeff, I want to start out with you. Can you explain to our listeners what exactly is ChatGPT and how does it work?
Yeah, so ChatGPT is an artificially intelligent chatbot. And in a way, you can think of it like a search engine that you can have a conversation with. Unlike a typical, like a Google search, or you can put basically, like, instead of it having to pointing to web pages, what it does is it can actually summarize information that it's drawn from the internet. So you can ask it, sort of natural language questions, and it's going to go get you an answer, and in a way that feels a lot different, and even have follow-up questions with it as you seek this answer.
What kind of questions have you asked?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I will admit, I asked it to, give me explain quantum physics. And one of the things that it kind of drew something like a Wikipedia entry answer. But one of the things that's different about ChatGPT is you can then have it kind of give it to you in a genre or reform the language in some other popular way. And so I then asked it to give me that same answer in the form of a story. And so it made it into a little short. I think I asked it to do it as a children's story, so it would explain it to me simply. And it came up with this yarn with a lead character named Max, and who was going into a cave and coming out with a lantern that acted like a wave and a particle.
I love your children's story example, because that's how I like people to explain things to me, and that was perfect. And because it's a language-based program, right? So, and there's a lot of concerns in terms of how students can use it. Is ChatGPT able to generate more than just essays? Can it also answer exam questions or multiple choice questions?
Well, exactly. Students have figured out very quickly that, in fact, the kinds of answers it can give are, the kinds of answers that teachers and professors kind of are looking for, the kind of questions they get for essays or homework questions. So it because it has access, it has access to internet, although it's not like live access at the moment, but it's drawn on all this information from the internet. It can do things like summarize a popular book, or even sort of give you, and then do it in a form of like a 5-paragraph essay if you ask it to.
And the app came out just a couple months ago, I believe in November, and it's already causing so much conversation. I mean, the fact that we're talking about it today, do you have an idea how it's impacting academia and changing conversations around academic integrity?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've covered colleges and higher ed for a long time, and I've never seen emergency meetings of academic integrity committees, but that is what's happening now. You have, for one thing, this is the fastest growing app of all time by some measures. So it just came out in November, ChatGPT, and it in 3 months it got to 100 million active users. It's faster than things like Twitter and other apps that now we all use. This is growing faster. It's emerging very quickly, and students are really learning about it quickly. I'm seeing a lot of evidence that TikTok is a big place where students are learning that it exists and how to use it. And so this is something that and teachers and instructors are figuring out quickly, that their students are knowing about it and using it. And so there is a question of what this means when the typical way that colleges tell whether a student has read a book or learned something that's been said in a lecture is that the student can then summarize it or synthesize it and put back, a short answer in text that explains it. But that's exactly what ChatGPT does. And so if a student asks the chatbot, turns that bot written text in, are you grading a student or a chatbot at that point?
I can't really imagine being in that position. And I know our conversation today is mostly focused on its impact on higher education. And I know it's a little early days, but it's spreading so fast. Do you know at this point, could it be used as a tool to improve your students' work or students in other disciplines? And I ask because I have been seeing a lot of teachers mentioning from maybe like the primary school education level or, middle school, high school, they're seeing it can be a tool to be used to improve writing or to do critical thinking. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not a teacher now. I cover teaching, but I do hear from a lot of professors that they're, even though they're concerned that this could be used to cheat, they're also, some excitement about thinking about what, if this is the tool that's out there, how could it be used in a positive way in teaching? One of the examples I heard from a professor was that they could have the student could have the chatbot write a draft, and then the student could grade the chatbot. And one of the things that's important to note about ChatGPT in its current form is that it's known to have inaccuracies in some of the information, probably because the internet has some inaccurate information on it. And so if the student is put in a position of like checking the chatbot's work, then they would need to know what the true information is. And so that could be a way to have the student show they know something, but it's a very different type of assignment than writing that text themselves.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just jump in, I would say it's very important. In some ways, if ChatGPT gets us to have students do that work, well, it's work we needed to be doing for the last 20 years, getting people to double check what they read on the internet, because there's the chance that it's wrong. But it is very different, Jeff, as you say, from using writing to know if students have mastered background knowledge, to using writing as a way to measure if they've learned something that everyone else already knows. And ChatGPT is, I think, always going to be better than the average student at showing what everybody else already knows. So in the long run, Catherine, this is Alfie speaking, by the way, I would say, unless teachers start asking students to write about things that are less certain or to write against the prevailing wisdom on things, it's going to be very hard to use ChatGPT to improve the writing itself. Because it's very good at summary. It's very good at synthesizing many, many, many sources. You give students a project to read about something, they might read, 3 to 4 things if it's a short paper, and 8 to 10 or 20 things if it's a 3-week project. But ChatGPT can read 1,000 things. It doesn't really read, but it can summarize from 1,000 sources at once. So it's always going to stay ahead of assignments for summarizing and giving an overview.
Well, thanks for jumping in, Alfred. I definitely want to go more in depth with you on that particular area. And you talking about it being able to read, or, quote, quote, read so much. I wish I can have that skill for my very long to be read list. So thanks for pointing that out, that I need to get on that. But I wanted to talk to you too, if you can just share with us, how did you get interested in AI as a writing professor?
So where I work at Yale, and I work in the Teaching and Learning Center, even though I direct the writing program, and we get questions from faculty about various things all the time. We have an open email address, and about December 4th, we started getting questions about ChatGPT. It came out on November 30th. And so some of us tried working with it and saw pretty quickly that the beginnings of its answers to things were very competent and often correct. The longer you have it right, the more it sort of makes mistakes and repeats itself. But professors' concerns that take-home exams that have large amount of synthesis were going to be compromised or made more complicated by this tool seemed relevant very, very quickly.
And you touched on this a little bit earlier, but what has your experience been using ChatGPT in the classroom? And are you surprised by what you saw? Did you expect what you saw? What are some of the things that you're seeing?
I'm very surprised. I had seen some AI writing before November 30th, and but even the sentences weren't very good. Never mind that it often made no sense. Like an AI text that I read this summer, every other sentence would feel like it was written by a different writer. They really weren't very good. And I'm very impressed at how good ChatGPT is at giving an overview and giving the background and sounding like someone who knows something about the thing you asked it. And I'm not that worried yet as a teacher because I ask students quirkier questions, but I was really surprised and impressed by how good it is. And I've probably run 50 or 60 different kinds of questions through it, in addition to reading a lot of articles where other people have done it. And it's a very powerful tool for generating texts.
And can you give us an example? I know you mentioned before that you used the Netflix series Squid Games as a way to have your students write or you asked ChatGPT to write an essay based on it. Can you talk about that experience a little bit?
Sure. So as it happens, I have a very small class this semester, and all the students had to write a question on the board in the first class, and 8 of the 12 questions were about ChatGPT on the very first day of class. So I knew that we were going to have to address it. So I had ChatGPT write an essay about Squid Game, which is a text I teach in my class. I teach a class it's called Speculative Fiction and Film. And we talked about what it was doing that they thought was part of their job in writing the essay. And then what was it not doing? And essentially my sort of inspirational speech was to say, try to do more of the things that it's not doing. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for what humans can do that ChatGPT can't do yet. Please push your papers in that direction. I will say students were not as impressed as I was. I don't know if it's because they're more used to relying on what machines can do and trusting them, or if it's just that I have I'm more shocked by the jump in what it could do before and what it can do now than they are. Maybe they weren't paying attention, but they thought, yeah, sure, it could help me find directions to a certain area, but I wouldn't expect it to give me life advice, kind of.
Right. And obviously you're having these conversations through examples and through your teachings, but do you have any, I don't want to say advice, but maybe guidelines for other professors on how do you start that conversation with students about using ChatGPT in the classroom?
Well, I would say that I think in the long run, that conversation has to break down 2 different things we use writing for. And Jeff mentioned both of them, but I would just put them in almost different categories. One is we use writing to measure whether people have learned something. And we use writing to help people learn something. Writing is a technology that allows you to synthesize your thinking, to take things you're starting to feel sure of or you're uncertain of and write your way towards a deeper and deeper understanding. And I talk to my students about how I want them not to give that up, that they're in college presumably because they want to become more sophisticated thinkers. They want to become people who can solve important problems as they emerge. And if you let a program do that writing, the writing that you're supposed to be doing while you're learning something, you won't learn it. If you think of writing only as a product you turn in for someone else to measure, I understand why you would be tempted to use ChatGPT. But if you remember that we're actually assigning you these tasks because we want you to develop skills, then maybe you'll agree not to give that opportunity away.
And Jeff, as an editor, do you see this as a way to improve students' work or, anyone's work really when it deals with language?
Yeah, no, honestly, it definitely makes you, all writing teachers tell you, don't just use cliches, but when you see, anybody that's used even the auto correct on your, Google Docs or whatever, if you're going to write the most predictable thing, then that is, a missed opportunity as a human. And I think it does put pressure on, on humans to work, to be good at being human and not just write the most predictable thing. And I think, that's one thing that it does for all of us, but also I think it also reminds me too that that bringing new information is also important, and it reminds me that there's this it's just kind of a circular system inside the internet. And by being humans and observing the world, like we're bringing something too. So as the reporter function in our newsroom, I'm also encouraging everybody to like get out there and, talk to more people and don't just be in the echo chamber of the internet.
And you're in a very interesting position too. You're in a newsroom. So how are you having those conversations with your fellow reporters and editors?
Well, I think, we're certainly in early days of this, so it hasn't been that many conversations yet. But I think that, there's not a sense that people are going to be going to ChatGPT to do our work, I don't think. But I do think that the questions are what are these things going to mean for publishing and you getting our work out to folks, because as these chatbots become built into search engines, then are people going to be pointed to our articles, or are we how do we make sure we're getting to an audience if the internet around us is changing? So it's sort of a more of a publishing question as well.
Right. And I want to bring the conversation back to the classroom a little bit. Alfred, earlier you talked about students' investment in the class being a good deterrent to using these programs. Does that mean we might see them used in more introductory classes at the undergraduate level rather than, say, a grad student doing their master's or PhD?
I would expect that. I would expect a grad student or a master's student to find what ChatGPT can do to be unsatisfactory. So when you ask ChatGPT a question about something that you don't know, it sounds very coherent. And if you know a little bit, you think, well, this is almost right. And then if you ask it about something that you've been researching and studying and thinking a lot about, you realize, oh, it's to some degree, it's spouting nonsense. It's repeating itself. It's saying only the most superficial things. And so I would expect most people, even I'd say juniors and seniors who are majors in a field, to start to be able to realize I can do better than ChatGPT. It may take me longer. ChatGPT can write a C- essay that I could write in 10 minutes instead of taking hours, but I can definitely do better work, make it go deeper in my analysis, bring in more surprising connections. I would expect, there are a lot of lower class assignments, but what I mean is for younger students, high school and college age students, where, as Jeff said right at the outset, the assignment essentially is show us that you read something. And it would be more acceptable to turn in ChatGPT output for that. Like it works better for that. And so, just to jump a step ahead, I think adding things to your assignments that require that students insert their own experience or reflect on what seems problematic or troubling or upsetting about something, and not just what happened in it, are sort of the beginnings of ways to make the questions a little bit harder for any AI writer to do a good job of.
You've been hearing from Alfred Guy. He is the R.W.B. Lewis Director of Writing and Tutoring at Yale University, and Jeff Young, who is the editor at EdSurge, an education journalism initiative. They will both be staying with us to talk more about academic integrity when it comes to ChatGPT. That's coming up next. Let us know if you have a question about ChatGPT. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live, and I'm Catherine Shen. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We're back with Alfred Guy. He is the R.W.B. Lewis Director of Writing and Tutoring at Yale University, and Jeff Young, who is the editor at EdSurge. They're both writing and thinking about artificial intelligence in the classroom, and we will now talk about how universities are reacting to ChatGPT. You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Jeff, we want to start with you. What are some tools that you know of that universities are using to detect AI use in student work? Is that a challenge? Is it difficult? What are you seeing?
Yeah, it's very early, but I think there's the fundamental question of whether this is going to be as detectable as previous forms of tools that students used to cheat on or to turn in other people's work as theirs. There have long been these plagiarism detection tools that professors have had at their disposal at most universities these days that can quickly find out if something is something that's already been written on the internet. But because ChatGPT is generative, meaning it like made up an answer, it's not going to be detectable in that same way. And so the first question is, can a tool be built that can reliably say this was definitely a bot and this was definitely a human? And even though it's just been a few months, there have been a couple tools that have come out. One by a Princeton university student called GPT-0 to help detect. And the folks that made ChatGPT have talked about that they're working on tools that will be able to tell as well whether something is bot written or not.
Well, you're mentioning sort of the bot versus human scenario. We've been focusing the conversation more on language, like writing essays and responding to exam questions. But what about the limitations of this? Could this be used for math and sciences as well as writing?
Yeah, there is a way in which it can do more than just the language that we've been talking about. In fact, it can answer questions related to coding, and it certainly can also answer things regarding to math too. And of course, in the math world, there have already been tools that have come out even before ChatGPT that would do that. Obviously, there are things like graphing calculators that shook up math instruction. So in some ways, folks in teaching math have had a preview of this fundamental challenge we've been talking about of how to measure whether the student knows something or whether they understand how to use a tool to get the answer.
And Alfred, I know your focus is more on writing, but I also want to ask, do you see limitations from where you're standing?
Well, I like Jeff. Well, maybe he doesn't agree with this, actually. I'm not convinced in the long run that detectors are going to be that useful for AI writers. I think the tools that work well now look for something that's somewhat stable, some stable presence of a text on the internet, and compare it. And I'll also say a lot of academic integrity centers at universities will only proceed against a student when they have absolute evidence of the original text. And so I don't think a prediction by something like GPT-0 is going to be very strong evidence. I was just going to say something. I don't really know, Catherine, this is what you're asking me, so feel free to interrupt. But one thing we know about plagiarism before ChatGPT-0 is that there are things you can do to reduce the likelihood that students would cheat. So even before you could find all their answers on the internet, if you have students write in class in a low stakes, ungraded way about something, they're less likely to cheat on the graded version of it. If you have students talk about what they're writing with other students, they're less likely to then turn around and turn in something different that they didn't write. And so there are forms of teaching that not only give people a heads up, or I should say a head start on what they're going to write and reduce the panic of the blank page when it's time for them to turn in their work, but also make them feel motivated and connected to, and they care about the work more when they've had a chance to do small bits of it and discuss it with other people. So I'm more optimistic about teaching, at least college students, how to get in a place where they want to do their own work than I am in building a tool that will, in the long run, be able to catch this kind of generative writing. It's awfully good already. Out of the box, it's really good, and I just think it's only going to get better at making new texts.
Well, and then both of you touched on this earlier too, that this is really not necessarily a new conversation we're having about AI and tools that students have to, help with their work in the classroom. But can you talk about the guidance that Yale has released about AI? Do you see an increasing concern about academic integrity? And is there a need for more conversations, especially since the app came out a couple months ago?
So I think I would boil down our current AI guidance. And by the way, it's definitely a work in progress. We wrote it in January, and there's already been a lot more use of the tool since then. But currently, there's sort of three main things. We say you can ask students slightly different questions than you were asking before that rely a little bit less on synthesis and a little bit more on pushing the edge of what's known. You can change the assignment itself. So for instance, one of the professors, we had a faculty discussion of this a couple of weeks ago, and Justin Farrell in the sociology department talked very movingly about assignments that require collaboration with people, that require you to do ethnographic observation or to go in sight to the places you're studying and use your experience as part of the learning. And writing up those kinds of things would actually be harder to get ChatGPT to help you than it would be to do on your own. And you also feel so much more connected to them. And then just to quickly repeat myself, and finally, just having students do more things where you're watching them learn the material will put them in a place where they're less likely to then turn in someone else's work. So our guidance really focuses currently on how to help students learn and feel connected to their learning, rather than on how to, and to some degree, not asking them for things that ChatGPT is good at, rather than on scaring them or warning them. Although if you go to our website, you'll see there are some sample warnings about how to tell students not to use ChatGPT in their work.
And Jeff, we've been talking a lot about how ChatGPT can help with students' learning. So how do you respond to the argument that it's the students' loss if they use a tool, that they're not really actually learning?
Well, I guess that seems to be a way to sort of re-engage students in the whole process. I mean, I think one of the things that I hear from professors is, very much about getting assignments that spark the students to be engaged is the kind of answer to ChatGPT, not just a cat and mouse game of detecting. And so I think that is where I hear some actual interest and excitement by some professors I talk to, other than just the wariness of, oh my gosh, here's another thing I have to deal with. And so I think if that ends up being the outcome, that could be a very positive thing. If it does spark professors to rethink the kinds of questions they're asking and the kinds of assignments that are happening that might have been already a little outdated, if you will, based on the way the industries that these students will go into after they graduate operate. I mean, the internet itself is still relatively new. We all take it for granted, but the things are changing so fast that the questions really are around, like, if you can imagine these tools are going to just get better, and then what is that going to mean for the industries people work in? And how do you prepare students for a world where, they need to exercise their humanity so they can bring that to a world that's going to have these tools?
Well, then both of you mentioned earlier that there are other areas of learning where we've already had a preview when the calculator was invented. And even when Wikipedia was introduced, there was a lot of worry how these tools would impact learning. And Jeff, do you think ChatGPT is going to be, just another learning tool that we become more accustomed in the next several years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Wikipedia example is a good one. And I was really struck when Wikipedia first emerged. There was a lot of professors I talked with back then were very much like, there was this backlash of like, oh, you don't know where that information came from. It's written by somebody in their basement. You don't know where that's coming from. And think now like how trusted relatively that Wikipedia is. And I think people have a better sense over time of how Wikipedia gets made and the process that, yes, anyone can edit it, but somehow the structure behind it creates something that's pretty neutral and, reliable to a point that you can understand. And that's the trick, is that this tool came out so fast, ChatGPT, and now people are trying to understand like what can it do. It does feel like there's some sense that I know some professors are already just being like, well, that's just terrible, and the students should be checked to make sure they're not using it. But I feel like this time around, I'm hearing, it's anecdotal so far, but I'm hearing more professors kind of come into it being like, okay, well, this seems to be a thing that's going to be there. Let's think about what's the, assuming this is in the world, what do we do? Instead of with Wikipedia, where it was almost like a fight it, like this shouldn't be used at all attitude. But we'll see. It'll be interesting.
I'm definitely interested. Go for it, Alfred. We got about a minute left, but
one of the things that I'm going to say cracks me up, even though it's not very formal, crack me up about Wikipedia is there are a lot of Yale professors who write a Wikipedia entry as an assignment. And so I completely remember, Jeff, when people were so down on it. And then Wikipedia did improve its own internal structures to some degree, but I also think people changed their mindset and they turned towards it and thought, well, if I'm concerned that the representation of medieval tapestries is inaccurate, I'm going to have my medieval tapestry students write something on Wikipedia. And that will improve. I'm neutral to optimistic about what it's going to be like 10 years from now for college. I might be wrong. I will say student teacher ratio is a factor here. So making assignments that feel live to students, where you give them a chance to pursue questions that they're really interested in and support them while they pursue those rather than just leave them all on their own, is labor intensive. And my students, I'm not saying I'm the greatest teacher, but my students go further when I engage them on their ideas in progress. And the more students that I have personally, the less of that engagement I can give. And so I have some caution or worry or concern for people who have a lot of students, that it's not going to be as easy for them to figure out how to make every single person's project a personalized individual project for that student while also giving them feedback along the way.
Well, you can come and crack us up at any time. You've been listening to Alfred Guy, who is the R.W.B. Lewis Director of Writing and Tutoring at Yale University, and Jeff Young, who is the editor at EdSurge. Thank you both so much for coming on the show today and helping us understand ChatGPT better.
Thanks. It's been fun.
Catherine.
Coming up next, we're having Reed Blackman on. He's the author of Ethical Machines, Your Conscious Guide or Concise Guide to Totally Unbiased, Transparent, and Respectful AI. And we'll be talking about the ethics around artificial intelligence. You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. There's been a lot of talk about ethics when it comes to artificial intelligence, especially with the new program ChatGPT, which has been causing a lot of concerns in the academic world. Here to talk to us about some of those ethical dilemmas is Reed Blackman. He's the author of Ethical Machines, Your Concise Guide to Totally Unbiased, Transparent, and Respectful AI. Thanks, Reed, for joining us today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Reed, we've been talking a lot about academic concerns, and I think one of the biggest ethical dilemmas around AI has been making these programs fair and unbiased. And, some may think these are machines. How could they possibly be biased? But can you explain to us and to our listeners on how AI models end up with biases and those real-world impacts?
Yeah, sure. So you're right. That is, if there is the issue with AI ethics or the risks of AI, then the issue of bias or discrimination is the one. There are others, but it is the main one. So look, let's just take a sort of standard example, and let's stay in the realm of academia. Let's say you're using AI to, if you like, read the college applications to see who should get in. So you're trying to predict who are going to be the good students, who's worthy of being admitted, or something along those lines. Or maybe you will use it as maybe you're a bank and you're using it to figure out of the credit applications, who should you give credit to, or who should you grant a mortgage to. So those are two kinds of examples. Now, the way that AI works, I think is actually, I mean, the underpinnings of it are technologically complex, but at a conceptual level, it's quite simple. So AI is just software that learns by example. It's just software that learns by example. So if you're going to train it, if you're going to get your AI to learn who the good students are, or what the mortgage-worthy applications are, or who deserves an interview for the job, you're going to give it examples of the kinds of people that you've admitted in the past, given credit to in the past, interviewed in the past, and so on. But if all those examples of who you've done that to in the past exhibit some kind of bias or discriminatory attitudes or policies, or they've inherited certain kinds of bias or discriminatory policies, then you're going to wind up with biased examples that the AI learns from. So if you've been admitting primarily, let's just say, white men, or you've been giving more credit to white men than to, say, black men or black women or Asian men or Asian women, it's going to learn that, oh, white people are the kinds of people that we give credit to, that we admit to college, that we give job interviews to. And so it recreates and then scales that kind of bias. That's at least one way that you get biased or discriminatory AI. It's not the only way, but it is the go-to way, if you like.
So it sounds like it's the data set that AI learns from that's extremely important. Can you talk to us about how that works, and what does training AI models look like?
Yeah, so you use the word data. Data, in my, the way to make it really simple is to say that data is a fancy word for examples. And so it's learning by examples, it's learning by data. There's multiple sources. You might get data from all sorts of places. And you might, there might be data collectors that are distinct from the data scientists who are actually training these models. Now, what they're doing is they're taking all that data and they are, if you like, feeding it to, inputting it into what's called a learning algorithm. So, a mathematical tool, essentially. And what that mathematical tool, what that algorithm is doing is looking for a pattern in that data. More specifically, it's looking for a mathematical pattern in that data. So to give you a sort of non-controversial case, let's say it's photo recognition software and you've taken a bunch of pictures of your dog Pepe. And if you tell the software, hey, these are all pictures of my dog Pepe, it learns what Pepe looks like, not by looking at the eyes and the ears and the nose of Pepe, but rather by looking at the thousands of mathematical relations among the thousands of pixels contained in those pictures. That's the Pepe pattern in the data. So that's what it's looking for. So when you give it a new picture, if it finds that pattern in that new picture, it'll say, yes, that's Pepe, or no, it's not. So when you're giving it resumes, for instance, it's looking for that mathematical pattern, if you like, that it seems to indicate worthy of an interview. And then when you give it a new application or a new resume, if it manifests the worthy of a pattern, if it manifests that worthy of an interview pattern, then it'll say, yes, give this person an interview. If not, no, don't give them an interview.
And on a much related question, you mentioned, photo recognition, and you wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review about a real-world model called Opt-in, which was a tool used in healthcare, and the bias in this app had some serious ramifications. Can you explain what happened there?
Yeah, so that was by the company Optum, part of United Health. They created, accidentally, I should say, this is not intentional. That's one of the most concerning things about this. The problem is not that we've got biased or discriminatory engineers or data scientists. It's that there's loads of ways for bias to creep into the model without people knowing, the AI without them knowing. In that particular case, they were creating a piece of AI software that recommended to doctors and nurses who to pay more attention to, who needs care. And it wound up recommending to them to pay more attention to white patients than to sicker Black patients. And what explains that is with the training data, the examples that they used to train their AI, they used various variables, pieces of data, including who spent money on healthcare. The thought, in some way reasonable, was, well, one really good indicator that people need help is that they spent money on help in the past. And so the problem is, though, what they didn't realize is, well, it's only a good indicator of need of help if you've got the money. if you don't have the money to spend on healthcare, that doesn't mean that you don't need the help. It just means that you lack access to it, to healthcare. Since they trained their AI on these examples, and since historically in America, Black people have spent less money on healthcare, at least in part, maybe completely in part, no, maybe completely because they lacked the funds to spend on healthcare, it wound up discriminating against Black people, thinking that because they don't spend money on healthcare, they must not need as much help.
So it sounds like this has ramifications in a wide variety of areas. We've been focusing a lot about academic integrity, and you just mentioning, the hiring process in jobs and now in the medical world. How should we address the ethical challenges posed by the use of AI in fields such as law enforcement?
Yeah, so one thing I'll say is that I don't think that there's an industry or a field where AI is not going to come to play. And it's going to be particularly important whenever we have high-risk applications, whenever we're talking about, this is at a minimum, we're talking about decisions that have to do with people's access to the basic goods of life, food, security, health, medical care, et cetera. In the case of law enforcement, there are a variety of use cases. One of the most famous ones is probably facial recognition software. So people are, I think, mostly familiar with this. You can take a camera, you can point it at your audience, and if you've trained your AI to recognize certain kinds of faces, then it might pick out someone, let's say a suspect. And so one application is, let's use this to find the criminal in the crowd, right? Or let's say we've got a camera feed of someone committing a crime, and we throw that into our facial recognition software. We think it's Mike, and now we go arrest Mike. One major problem, though, and this has happened before, it's been reported a number of times, is that there are false positives. So it looks like this is Mike, but in fact, that wasn't Mike, it was John. But police have nonetheless overly trusted the facial recognition software, and then they go arrest Mike, put him in jail, et cetera. So there can be some phenomenally disruptive practices when AI goes wrong.
And should AI be regulated by governments or industry organizations? And if so, how should this be done?
Okay, so that's a very big question. My view is that we absolutely need regulation. There are lots of ways for AI to be used in ways that can really damage individuals and society as a whole. So think, for instance, about the spread of disinformation on social media platforms. That's in many cases powered by AI. Think about the spread of conspiracy theories. There's lots of ways. I mean, there's cases in which therapy chatbots have told people to kill themselves. Not good. So there are lots of high-risk cases. And so one way to do this, and this is actually the way that the European Union is doing it, they're working on what they call the EU AI Act. That's regulations pertaining to AI, of course, in the EU. And they want companies to, first, they're identifying those high-risk cases, which roughly have to do with respecting people's basic rights, ensuring they're not closed off from the basic goods of life. And they have to go through a kind of a rigorous process in order to identify those high-risk cases and to mitigate those risks. So we do need regulations. There's a question about, and it's a tough question, about whether the regulations should be, if you like, across the board, or if they should be created on a per industry level. So for instance, AI regulations for insurance versus banking, versus space versus mining versus telecommunications. And that's a really big, complicated debate.
Well, I want to thank you so much for answering those two questions. I just wanted to let everyone know that the last two questions I posed to Reed about law enforcement and regulations were actually generated by ChatGPT. Could you tell? Let us know if you did. Reed, I want to ask, what are your thoughts about those two questions? One was very specific, whereas the other one, and you mentioned it yourself, it was a bigger question.
They're perfectly reasonable questions. They're not terribly shocking. It's the kinds of questions that I get asked frequently and the kinds of questions that I talk about with people in the AI ethics space. So yeah, they were fine. I don't think you're going to get phenomenally, deeply penetrating, insightful questions out of ChatGPT, not yet anyway. But yeah, they're good as far as they go.
Well, that's good to know, because when I was reading it, I'm not going to lie, I did feel like I was a little stilted. So thanks so much, ChatGPT. We've been talking a lot about how the software itself could help educate, students and people in general. But what about more education needed for the people building the AI? We have a couple minutes left. I would like you to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, one of the biggest issues with AI ethical risks is that the people who are making this stuff, and it's not just the makers, it's also, let's say, the senior executives who are approving deployment, approving use of it, they know very little about AI ethical risks. They are not typically trained to spot them. They're not typically trained to mitigate them. And the truth is that it can't just be up to them. We're talking about highly complex systems that have all sorts of ethical ramifications. And your average data scientist is not trained in ethics or civil rights or sociology or anything like that. So there's a big learning curve for those technologists who are working on these technologies. But it's also crucial to educate the non-technologists who work with those technologists, because you're going to need a variety of people, a diversity of expertise and experience in order to provide proper oversight of AI as it gets developed and deployed.
So in terms of oversight, do you mean maybe training people to sort of organize a ethics board or so like an ethics committee? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's different ways of doing it. I mean, I am a big fan of thinking that organizations should have, you can call it an ethics committee or an AI ethical risk committee or a responsible AI committee. It gets called all sorts of things. I think those kinds of things are crucial, at least for those higher risk cases. One objection to them is that they slow things down. And what we want, so say the companies, is we want innovation, we want to move fast. And it does slow things down in some cases. But if you're only using it for at least those medium to high risk cases, and you're involving a cross-functional team, cross different kinds of expertise, it can do a tremendous amount to mitigate those risks. That said, it's not the board that is going to monitor the impacts. That's sort of not within their purview. All AI needs to be monitored, because once it's out in the wild, it's still learning. Those, we said earlier that it's learning by example. It's getting more and more data. But once it's out there in the world, it continues to collect data. And so it continues to learn. And that means it can continue to learn in a way that makes it go off the rails. So you need that constant monitoring by data scientists, but there also needs to be that feedback loop that what the data scientists find in their monitoring is also fed back to something like an ethical risk board.
Well, I think we'd be really interested to see how this develops. And thank you so much for your thoughts on that. You've been hearing from Reed Blackman. He's the author of Ethical Machines, Your Concise Guide to Totally Unbiased, Transparent, and Respectful AI. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, Reed.
Anytime. Thanks so much.
And just a note for our listeners, our senior producer, Tess Terrible, tried out ChatGPT for this program. She asked it to write some questions about AI ethics, and you can see the full list of questions on our website on ctpublic.org/wherewelive. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible, not ChatGPT. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app, and thank you so much for listening.